Hello, welcome to ELED 3320 and a discussion about realistic fiction. This is our next genre to talk about. So when we talk about realistic fiction, sometimes it's also called modern realistic fiction, but the definition of this genre is that it is a prose narrative. That means it's presented in sentence and paragraph form, not poetry form. It's a prose narrative presenting universal problems of people in the 21st century. If you can read about it in the newspaper, then it can show up in modern realistic fiction or in realistic fiction. This is a genre that is a favorite for lots of our student readers. They like to read about modern day problems. It is also the most censored of the genres. So this presents kind of a dichotomy. Kids really like to read it. It is one of the most censored genres. When we talk about realistic fiction, we're talking about books that deal with familiar situations, characters, and settings, which is precisely why many students like to read realistic fiction. Normally, we think of realistic fiction being aimed at kids in grades 3 and up, and typically they're not illustrated unless it is intended for a younger audience. And while beginning to read realistic fiction often represents the fact that the children are leaving picture storybooks behind, that doesn't mean that you as the teacher should stop using them. Picture storybooks are one of the best ways to reach students at higher grade levels, upper elementary, all the way up to high school. Even though many stories that are presented in picture storybook format have illustrations, that doesn't mean they don't also have meaty text and meaty situations. For example, books by Eve Bunting writes lots of picture storybooks that are realistic fiction. One in particular, called Fly Away Home, deals with the 21st century problem of homelessness. It's about a young boy and his father who are homeless and live in the city's airport. So just because kids are stopping or are kind of moving away from checking these books out on their own and reading them doesn't mean that as the teacher you should stop using them. When we think about evaluating realistic fiction, there's several things that you want to look for. First, you want to make sure that the book is going to give the reader some increased insight into his or her personal problems and or social relationships. So you want to make sure that the book helps students see that other kids have faced that same kind of problem before, or who have had that same kind of social relationship before. Kind of helps them take the blinders off. You also want to make sure that the book shows the reader that people are more alike than they are different. Many times students hang out with people who are just like them in lots of different ways. And sometimes we tend to fear what we don't know. We tend to not understand what we don't know. And so by reading, students can begin to see that people are a lot more alike than they are different. In addition, the book should convince the reader that through their own actions, they can change their lives. It's the whole pull yourself up by your bootstraps. If you work hard enough, you can succeed. Many times when we think about realistic fiction for kids, we're thinking about books that are about 150 to 200 pages long. Occasionally, nowadays, we're seeing books that are quite a bit longer than that. Think about authors like Judy Blume. We'll talk about her in a little bit. Gary Paulson. We're thinking 3rd, 4th, 5th grade and up for realistic fiction. So here's some other information that you might be able to use as you're evaluating books. The first bit is about age. What the research has shown is that chronological age, so how many years old you are, is more important than mental age, or your IQ, how smart you are, when trying to decide what kind of a book a child would enjoy reading. So when parents ask you for book recommendations, when kids ask you for book recommendations, think about how old they are uh, over how smart or how mature they are. And the reason for this is you want to make sure that students are reading material that is developmentally appropriate, appropriate in terms of maturity level, not just on their reading level. Okay, so you may have a second grader who's a really gifted reader, who's reading at an eighth or a ninth grade level, but that doesn't mean that they should be reading about the same topics that an eighth or a ninth grader is reading. We talked about this some when we talked about assessing readability. Okay, so you can always take into account chronological age. Kind of the death knell for a book for a kid who's reading realistic fiction is reading about a character who's younger than they are. Children generally don't want to read about characters who are younger than they are when they're reading realistic fiction. Some other information you can use, and I've hinted at some of this in class, but you can also take into account the research that shows how children are interested in books based upon their gender. So here on this slide, you see a list of what generally, and I say generally because this is not going to be true in every case, but what generally kids like to read based upon their gender. So for example, boys, the research shows that boys tend to prefer books with a male main character. They tend to prefer books that have a large cast of characters. They tend to prefer books that have a wide setting, so the story takes place in many different places. They tend to like books that have several plots woven together. They tend to like stories that take place over a long period of time, and they tend to like books that have characters who are described externally. So what do they look like, what do they like to do, where do they live, that kind of thing. Girls, on the other hand, tend to like books that have a female main character. Interestingly, girls will read either a book with a female or a male main character as long as it's a good story. Girls tend to like books that have a small cast of characters. They tend to like books that take place in a confined setting, like at summer camp or at somebody's house or at the high school. They tend to like books that have a direct, straightforward plot, not a lot of interwoven plots. They tend to like books that have a neat unit of time, so over a weekend or over the summer or over sophomore year. And they tend to like books that have internal characterization, so books where it tells you what the character thinks, how they feel, what the character's motivations are. Okay? So with these specialized reading interests, we tend to see these start developing in our students around 5th grade. And here's some more information you can use. So not just those laundry lists that I gave you on the first 2 slides, but for example, specialized reading interests in terms of animals. Girls tend to gravitate toward books about horses and cats. Boys tend to gravitate to books about dogs. Adventure. We used to see some differences in this. In the past, we've seen that adventure books were typically more appealing to boys, but that's beginning to change, and that's happening because of books like The Hunger Games, where it's definitely an adventure book. It's specifically a dystopian novel, not necessarily realistic fiction, but the main character is a girl. Katniss Everdeen is a girl. So we're starting to see some books about adventure stories that are appealing to girls. Same thing is true with sports. Used to, sports books appealed more to boys, but with the advent of Title IX and equality, the pushes for equality between the sexes, we're seeing that there are many sports books that appeal to girls as well. So when we think about these specialized reading interests, what we know is that some readers never grow out of these interests. So as I went through those lists of characteristics, you may have thought, well, I'm a girl and that's not what I like to read, or I'm a boy and that's not what I like to read. So you may have grown out of that. You really grow out of those reading interests, and our students grow out of those reading interests based upon how much they read. So the more you read, the more broader um, a range of interests tend to appeal to you. Lots of people don't read enough to ever break out of these kind of stereotypical reading interests. The implication here, the takeaway, is that if we're going to teach in the most effective way, we need to teach with multiple books, not with whole class novels. We need to give students some choice. So one way to break that down is maybe here's a book that we're all going to read together. Here are a variety of books that you're going to read in small groups, maybe using literature circles or maybe using guided reading. And then you're also going to have a free choice book, a book that you choose on your own to read. But if we only ever teach using the whole class novel approach where everybody is reading the same thing, we're not taking into account these specialized reading interests. So we need to be aware of that. In the next video, I will share with you some additional information to help you think about how to match kids to realistic fiction books based upon some stages of reading maturity and some adolescent developmental tasks.